All right, sixth graders, we are still in our unit about integers. So remember on the last page of notes, we looked at what do integers look like on the number line and what an integer is and how to compare them. And we're going to extend this idea a little bit today with the idea of absolute value. So the title of this page is absolute value. And so we're going to draw a number line just like we did beforehand. So we're still dealing with the integers. Remember, those integers are 0 and the positive integers. So go ahead and draw you a number line. I'm only going to go out to 4 on this one. Remember, numbers go on forever. Negative numbers in the left direction. And so I'll give you a second. Go ahead and draw your number line and make sure you have your numbers labeled. And so let's talk about this idea of absolute value. So we know that we have our positive integers on this side on the right side of 0. We know we have our negative integers on the left side. So the idea of absolute value comes from distance. So let's pretend, and you can draw this in if you want to or not, but let's pretend that we're a little ant, a little bug, standing at 0. All right, I don't know if you can see my ant there. There you go. And let's pretend like this ant decides that he is going to walk from the number 0 to the number 3. And so he starts walking, and of course he walks, and then he ends up at 3 and he stops. All right. So if you were looking at this ant, how far would you tell him that he has walked? Well, hopefully we would say something like 3 units. Now, we don't know if these are miles or feet or what. There's just 3 units of measure from 0 to 3. Now, let's pretend that this ant, let's pretend like he's back at 0. And let's pretend like instead of walking to positive 3, let's pretend like he turned around and actually walked to negative 3. So he's going to end up here this time. And so again, he's starting at 0 and he's walking to negative 3. How far would you say that he walked? Would you say that he walked negative 3 units? Well, no, there's no such thing as walking a negative distance, right? Even though he's going in the left direction, he still has to travel 1, 2, 3 units. And so it does not matter what direction you move in away from 0. The number, remember, these are opposite numbers from each other, right? 3 and negative 3 are opposites from each other. We call this distance the absolute value. So what we would say is that the absolute value of 3 is 3 units away from 0. And we would say the absolute value of negative 3 is also 3 units away from 0. So the definition of this term absolute value, so absolute value, is the distance a number is away from 0. So the absolute value, what we're dealing with here, is the distance a number is away from 0. Now notice that even though, and we pointed this out up here, even if we were to go in the positive direction or the negative direction, distance is still positive. And so this is a very important concept that we need to make sure we get, that distance is always positive. I always like to use the example when we're in class. Let's say that, Billy lives, let me find a scrap sheet of paper and maybe I can draw this out. So here's just a scrap piece of paper. You don't have to write this down, but let's say here's the school. So here is our school. And let's say that Billy's house is over here, right? And let's say that when Billy rides his bike home of the evenings, he has to ride 1.5 miles, right, in this direction. Well, let's say that Joey lives down here. Would we say that Joey has to ride negative 1.5 miles to get to his house? Well, no, it's in a different direction, but it's the same amount of distance, right? And so it does not matter what direction we're going in. Distance is always positive if you're moving forward. And so that's the idea of absolute value here. All right, now we have some notation that we use. So, for example, the symbol for absolute value are these two really tall bars. They're bars that reach, it's not like an 11, but it's bars that reach from the top of the line to the bottom of the line. So the symbol for absolute value is this. So for example, we would look and we would say, okay, we would have a bar and then we would have a number. And so let's say -4. And then we would enclose it in a bar. And the way we would say this is we would say the absolute value of -4. And we would read it when we see those tall bars. We would say the words absolute value. So the absolute value of -4. All right. And then what would the answer be? So if I'm working the problem out, if I see these really tall bars and I see -4 inside of them, I read that as what's the absolute value of -4? Well, let's look on the number line. If you think about being at 0 and walking to -4, how many units, what's the distance that you have walked? 1, 2, 3. It's 4 units, right? And so the absolute value of -4 would be 4. Well, think about that similarly if we have the absolute value of +4. Well, how far away is 4 from 0? Well, it's 1, 2, 3. It's 4 units, right? And so if you'll notice, the answer to an absolute value problem, so the answer is always the positive number. I'm just going to put the number symbol there, the hashtag, that means number. The answer is always the positive number. So if you think about, well, how far away is -4? It's 4 units. How far is +4? It's 4 units. The answer here is always going to be positive. So really you can think if my number here is negative, I'm really just going to take the negative off of it. And if it's positive, I'm just going to keep it positive. So let's look at a couple more examples. So let's say examples. So let's do 4 examples. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Let's say, what would the absolute value of 10 be? And so notice again how I'm making these bars really big. What you don't want to do is you don't want to write it like this. You don't want to write absolute value of 10 like that, because that looks like 1,101. You want to make sure that the bars are much bigger than the number that's going to be inside of your absolute value bar. So we would say the absolute value of 10. And then let's do the absolute value of 0. And let's do the absolute value of -6. And then let's do one where maybe we didn't see the bars, but there will be some questions that are just asked to you in word form. So what if you're just asked the absolute value of -17? So there's no bars around it, but the words are implying that there should be bars around it. All right, so let's answer these questions. Number 1, the absolute value of 10. How far away is 10 from 0? It's 10 units. Keep the number if it's positive. Absolute value of 0. That's how far away is 0 from 0? Well, 0 is right on top of 0. Absolute value of 0 is 0. The absolute value of -6. Well, -6 would be 6 units away in the negative direction. But again, we just take the negative off, make it positive. Absolute value of 6 is 6. Now, if you don't see the bars, but you do see the words absolute value, what is the absolute value of -17? That's really asking, what's the distance that -17 is from 0? The answer is just going to be, again, take the negative off. Now, make sure, I've seen the mistake happen. I've seen students see the positive number, and then they want to put they want to switch the sign and put a negative. Your answer here should never be negative. It should always be positive. All right, so those are some examples of what absolute value problems are going to look like and how we're going to solve them. And that's pretty easy. Just write the number down without the negative, or again, without the negative. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to compare numbers. So let's compare. And we did this the other day where we did some comparisons and we had to fill in greater than or less than. So let's say, what if we compared the absolute value of -6 compared with 5, and so I'm going to leave a blank there in the middle. We'll compare those. What if we did the absolute value of -8 compared to the absolute value of -4? And then what if we did the absolute value of 9 compared to the absolute value, actually, no, let's not put an absolute value. Let's make this the number 13. All right. So we're going to compare these to each other. All right. And actually, I'm going to leave that like it is. All right, so anytime you see these absolute value bars, there's a little bit of work you have to do first, right? Because this is not representing the number 6 or -6. This is representing the absolute value of -6. And if we have to ask ourselves, what is the absolute value of -6? Well, we answered it up here. It's just the positive value. So what we're actually comparing is 6 compared to 5. Which one is bigger, 6 or 5? Well, 6 is bigger. And so we're going to make the arrow eat that direction. All right, now if these were just plain numbers, if this was -8 compared to -4, we learned about this last set of notes that the bigger a negative number is, actually the less that it is. So if we didn't have absolute value bars, the arrow would need to go this way. -4 is bigger than -8. However, since we have absolute value bars here, of course we have to make these positive. The distance that -8 is from 0 is 8. The distance that -4 is from 0 is 4. Which one of 8, between 8 and 4, which one's going to be eaten? 8 would be eaten, so this one's going to be greater than as well. All right, the absolute value of 9, it's in those absolute value bars, so I have to take it and evaluate. What is the absolute value of 9? Well, it just stays positive. Remember, don't switch it to negative. And then I'm comparing 9 to 13, and of course 13 is larger. So you are going to do some comparisons. Oh, let's do one more, because this one's an interesting one. What about the absolute value of -8 compared to the absolute value of 8? How would we compare those? Well, again, if this is a negative number and a positive number, we know a positive number is always bigger. So the arrow, the alligator would be eating the 8. However, the absolute value of -8 is +8. The distance that -8 is from 0 is 8. And the distance that +8 is from 0 is 8. And so what's true about 8 and 8? Those are actually equal because we have those absolute value bars around them. So you are going to do some practice. First of all, your practice on your quizzes and IXL are going to use some number lines, and you're going to have to map out what the absolute value and measure distances on your number line. How far is a certain number away from 0? And then you're going to see a bunch of problems with these absolute value bars around them. Remember, your answer is always positive. And then you're also going to do some comparisons with greater than or less than. Make sure that if you see absolute value bars around it, you think of this number as a positive number. If you have any questions, make sure you email me and ask. And good luck with your practice on absolute value.